It appears the Jets are wasting no time with starting their head coaching search, and yeah, they've already interviewed somebody, and we'll talk about who and why they are not a fit for the Jets on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we have some fun stuff to talk about. The Jets have interviewed Craig Berube, which I think caught most of us not by surprise. I think we all knew that was going to happen. Berube is one of the names that's been linked to the Jets, although I would say he probably was not as strongly linked as Sheldon Keefe. It feels like of the current head coaching vacancies, and of the available candidates, the Jets keep getting mentioned with Keefe as being a potential thing. So something to keep an eye on. But Berube, I know, has also been very much in demand. And it seems like in terms of the head coaching market, he is one of the most hotly desired names, which is interesting to me because the last couple of seasons with the Blues were not very good. So yeah, I mean, I know he has a cup, and I think that does a lot for his resume. But in terms of what he's actually accomplished with his other teams, or with his previous teams recently, I think is something that can definitely be questioned. But before we dive into why he's perhaps not the right fit for the Jets, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, like I said, obviously for the Jets, Winnipeg has to be relatively choosy with their coaching decisions, right? You know, Winnipeg doesn't have tons of capital to burn on coaching staffs that don't end up working out. They're probably still paying off at least some part of Maurice's contract. I don't know. I don't know how much guaranteed money he had or if it's even expired at this point. But in terms of, you know, being economical and making the right selection, the Jets have to be very careful not to get themselves in a situation that they're going to regret very quickly. And Berube is one of those guys who I think would not end up lasting very long with Winnipeg. For one thing, he's definitely the kind of coach that plays lower event hockey, and Winnipeg needs to get faster and more aggressive, whereas Berube is the kind of guy who really favors slower, grindier, more physical teams. And we just saw the Jets have that in the playoffs and get utterly manhandled. You know, Colorado ate through the Jets like it was a Sunday afternoon tea. Pretty bad, very ugly performance. And Berube is the kind of guy who really likes the slower, more physical side of hockey, which means that a lot of the young kids that he didn't play for a long time, whether it was Thomas or Kyrou, you know, they didn't really get into the lineup and make an impact until later in his career when he basically was forced to start playing them. So I don't look at him as a particularly progressive coach. And I think for what the Jets need, he is just not the right guy. He's bonus with a cup and perhaps even a less enthusing style. You know, I really feel like I watched the Blues over the past couple of years, and like, make no mistake, their roster is not good. They're a team that definitely needs to rebuild, but by the same token, Berube really didn't help things either. I know he has a cup to his resume, and I know a lot of people will say that the team was successful with him, and that is partially true, but it was probably one of those situations where St. Louis may have gotten to the Cup Finals more in spite of some of the coaching decisions, and you know, that's sometimes how it has to be, right? There aren't a lot of coaches out there that don't come with some sort of baggage, but Berube in particular, his teams have really poor underlying numbers. They play a style of hockey that was suited more towards the old Jets and not the current Jets, and I think for what Winnipeg really needs to start thinking about for the future, he's just not the guy. And to top it all off, he wants to be one of the most expensive coaches out there. So that's a big, big, big fat no. And by all accounts, it sounds like the Jets were only doing due diligence. It was not an in-person meeting. It was like a Zoom call or something. So I think a lot of us probably are wiping a little bit of sweat from the brow. No disrespect to Berube. He's had a really successful career for the most part. And I think in some areas, if you have a team that's got limited skill, I think he might be a legit solid option as a coach. Just you have to understand that, you're going to be bunkering a lot. You're going to be sitting deep. And unless you're built to be a counter-first kind of team, I don't know if that's really the best approach, but maybe some low-skill team is going to make the most of his coaching ability. But it seems like he might be in demand in Toronto, which is kind of funny because I feel like going from Keefe to Berube is a big step back. Keefe, for all of his faults and flaws, was definitely a more up-tempo, offensively minded coach, and that is where, the Jets are probably looking to make their next port of call. But if Keefe goes to the Devils, obviously Winnipeg is going to have to do a little bit more creative thinking. And I think that's where it is kind of nice to see them actually searching and interviewing folks. I thought that they would just kind of make Arniel the next head coach, and that was going to be the decision. I still think at the end of all of this, Scott ends up being the coach, but I got to be honest, it's nice to at least show that there's some kind of a process. Maybe there's an interview somewhere here over the next few weeks where the Jets are just blown away. I really feel like I want to know more about Todd Nelson. Woodcroft, of course, would be interesting. McClellan, I would probably steer clear of. I don't think Todd is a particularly great fit for the Jets, and I think at this point he's been around enough teams to where you know what he's gonna do for your team. He'll be a kind of a coach who can get some solid production out of veterans, and certainly his teams tend to generate a decent number of shots, but the rest of the stuff is just not really that impressive. So something to keep an eye out for. Obviously, depending on how the playoffs go for some of the current teams that are still in the race, maybe a couple more head coaches become available. Brendan Moore, of course, is one of the biggest ones. Maybe Montgomery, if the Bruins do something really crazy. Can't see that happening, but you never know. But, for what Winnipeg needs, it might be time to start thinking about some external candidates, right? Because the current pool doesn't seem super exciting. Keefe, if he gets snatched up pretty soon, which it sounds like the Devils are going to make a really strong play for him, I could see that being a bit of a dent for the Jets. I think Winnipeg is very strongly considering Sheldon and has probably made overtures that way, but the fact that he keeps getting linked to the Devils job makes me think he is probably signing there in the next week or two. So a lot to keep in mind, but for the Jets, obviously, the head coach search is one of the biggest things. It's not the only order of business, though. And I think that's where Winnipeg has to have a more macro level view. They've got to think, from the organization top down, what are the needs for Winnipeg's future and present? And that's where I think, next season's evaluation period is going to be really big. The Jets are going to get a good sense of where some of their prospects are, where the new coaching staff sits, and how all of these pieces work together with the existing core foundation, because the Jets core as it is getting old, and, a lot of them are expiring here pretty soon with new contracts being needed or trades likely to be facilitated. So, a lot to consider, but on that sort of vein of thought, I wanted to talk about a couple of major young players who are going to have a big part of this team's future, whether it's short-term or long-term. And we'll talk about, Brad Lambert and Cole Perfetti in particular, because I think both of them have some really intriguing questions and long-term development trajectories that could shape how the Jets approach the next couple of off seasons and even this off season with respect to who the Jets might sign. So we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. It's winner-take-all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big victory of your own. Obviously, the Jets are out of the playoffs, but you know what? There are plenty of other teams still vying for the Stanley Cup. Maybe you think Dallas is going to pull it off this year. Maybe you're thinking the Panthers under Maurice has a chance, or maybe you still hold a flame for Blake Wheeler and you're hoping the Rangers get through. No matter who you're rooting for in this current playoff picture, it's really a great time for you to cast your bet, because FanDuel is offering new customers a great offer where you can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to use on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. And it's not like you have to bet on anything crazy. You can bet on single games. You can bet on stat lines, whatever you're interested in. FanDuel has you covered. So just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just checking out some thoughts ahead of, a busy offseason and a busy next season, because Winnipeg, for me, has a lot of hard decisions to make. And I think if you're the Jets, you want to get a good sense of where your prospects are, where your NHLers are, and how you can start to really integrate the youth into a team that is more competitive and faster and skilled. I think all of these things would be achievable next season, but probably won't coalesce into something really fun until the year after, because you're going to need your younger players to have at least a full season of NHL time before they really start to ramp up and get comfortable at this level. It's entirely possible that all of them hit the ground running, next season and things look really good quickly, but I would imagine that there's going to be what I've alluded to in previous episodes, a bit of growing pain, right? You just have to expect it. It's probably going to happen. And I think it's going to hit for all of our young players, maybe even Cole Perfetti. Although with Perfetti, he's probably played enough to where you sort of know where he's deficient and where he's going to work on and what he wants to grow in. But one of the guys that's kind of a big mystery right now, not because we haven't seen a lot of him, but because it's hard to get a read on what his best position is. It's Brad Lambert. And Lambert, of course, is one of our most touted, highly touted prospects, one of our most exciting young players. And for me, I envision him to be one of our highest ceiling, most skilled prospects with a super bright future and a lot of bust potential. Although with how he's done at the AHL level, I don't think you have to worry about that. I think he's going to be a pretty quality NHLer. I think it's just a question of just how good is he going to get, right? We've seen him really improve over the past couple of seasons, and his confidence is there. The skill level is there. His NHL caliber reading is there. It's just, does he do it as a winger or as a center? And as a winger, he's kind of been okay. You've seen some solid transition play, and you've seen a couple of moments where he's been able to create space and get a nice shot off, but it seems like he really thrives at center. I want to talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a moment, but just wanted to let you know, for all of you Fox Sports and ESPN watchers, sometimes you might have to find yourself turning down the volume with, with all the shouting and stuff, and we get it. We, as a listener to other sports podcasts and stuff, I can tell you, I don't like it. I think a lot of our other podcast hosts don't like it. And that's why we make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you daily to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the Amazon Fire TV channels app, which is free. All part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, Brad Lambert is one of the most intriguing prospects in Winnipeg's pool because, quite frankly, he has a lot of tools and traits that remind people of Ehlers. Ehlers was a transition expert who carried the puck into dangerous areas and could create from almost nothing. Lambert is much the same way. He's a very explosive skater. He's got a great shot. He's got very soft hands. His passing and vision are really high level, and it seems like in terms of being an individual talent, there's not many prospects in the pool that just have the sheer skating ability and offensive skill that he has. I feel like he is at some point a first-line talent. I don't know when he'll eventually reach that level. It could never happen, but I have a really good feeling about him that he's on almost a meteoric rise. He had 55 points in the AHL as a rookie this past season. That's pretty freaking fantastic, right? I know he had some AHL games earlier last year, but I think this year he really blossomed into a can't miss surefire kind of prospect. And I don't mean that to suggest that he's going to be a first liner as soon as he joins the Jets. I think, there's going to be some growing pains. He'll have defensive reads and things that he misses. He might have some, yips and stuff that he has to get over. But I think generally speaking, I expect him to be a contributor almost from the first game. He seems really fun. I think he's a really hardworking player. He's very fast, and when he's in possession with the puck, he creates instant threat when he's in the offensive zone. His perimeter play, it's still a work in progress. I mean, he's, 20 years old? Not many kids his age immediately start lighting the pros up, especially with how high the skill barrier is these days. I know we talk about a lot of NHL teams having, mediocre and middling players, but I think it just masks the fact that it's very hard for young kids to break into lineups, much less actually excel at this level. So some stuff to consider, but I feel pretty confident in saying that Lambert next year is going to be like a 40 to 45 point rookie, maybe even closer to 50 points if we're really lucky. I just have that sense with him, and depending on the role that he's given, and this is going to play a big part of the projection, he could be a key middle six contributor who starts to push into like second line territory. Now, the big question for me is what happens if the Jets re-sign Monahan. I really feel like that's going to be a mistake, not because Monahan's a bad player, but I just feel like if you're trying to think about how to make the most of the next couple of seasons with the existing core, plus the young kids that are coming in, I think it'd probably be more helpful to have Lambert as the second line center. It's a lot of responsibility to ask of him, and if it doesn't work out within a small sample size, I could see the need to switch it and give him less time. But I feel like Brad has proven at the AHL level, at least, that he's very comfortable handling a primary star scoring role. He was one of Manitoba's top attackers. He was one of the top rookies in the whole AHL. And I feel like he just oozes skill and confidence at a level to where I feel comfortable giving him a shot to take that number 2C role. Now, again, like I said, it depends entirely on what happens with Monahan, and it'll also depend on the coaching staff. If Winnipeg elects to go with a more safe, known quantity of a coach, you might run into a problem where Lambert is really relegated to like fourth line minutes, and that's not necessarily the worst thing, especially early on, but I think you're not going to get the most out of his offensive talents. He's a brilliant talent. He seems like he's just continuing to improve in all facets of the game. I think the offensive skill that he has for days is something that the Jets have sorely needed. You know, they definitely need that extra level of scoring, the extra level of skating, the overall offensive threat in the slot and around the faceoff circles. All that stuff he can do, and I feel like for the Jets to only give him fourth line minutes next season would probably be a bit of a waste. Not a complete waste. Obviously, getting him up to NHL speed is going to be good no matter what, and he might be able to sort of improv in those limited minutes to make stuff happen, especially in a good depth role. But I think if you really want the most out of him and you really want to have a successful year with him, next year should be a second line, sort of deployment, whether it's at center or at wing. I prefer center because I think that's where he's most likely to be successful long-term. Wing, you can try it. I just don't know that that's, again, the best place to work with him. And honestly, you look at the Jets center depth, that's really where they're weakest. You look at the right side defense, that's another big area. But in terms of stuff that the Jets can fix right now, second line center might be the most addressable with Lambert, relatively speaking. And I don't say that to mean that he's going to be a second line center immediately. It's just I could see him growing into that role over the next couple of years. Next season, I would try it to see what happens. And if it doesn't work and if he's clearly overwhelmed, then yeah, push him back, more into the bottom or middle six. That's fine. But I think at least giving it a shot and seeing what happens wouldn't be the worst. He's a kid who definitely thrives with confidence and skill. And I think if you give him the right line mates, he might really blossom into an elite scoring threat. But we'll have to give him time and see if he can really hit those heights. I will say that the AHL performance so far is very promising. So that makes me happy. I'm excited to see him grow with Winnipeg. I was, absolutely on the moon when he was drafted, a year or two ago. So a couple of years ago now. Time really does fly, man. But let's just say I was screaming and hooting and hollering when he got drafted. I couldn't believe he fell to the Jets at 30th overall. He's one of my favorite prospects Winnipeg has ever drafted, and I just think the world of him. I think he's got a lot to live up to, and so far he has answered the call. I mean, you look at the vast majority of AHL players the Jets have either drafted or signed, and Lambert has really outshone almost all of them. So very excited. I think he's got a bright future, and it could be starting as soon as next season. He does have competition, though, in one way, and I think Cole Perfetti might be able to eat up some of his minutes. We'll talk about where Cole could play and whether or not he really should be the second-line center. All of that coming up in just a little bit. Before we dive into too much more, though, just wanted to let you know about our partners at Policygenius. You've probably heard the story before. I broke my wrist in a concert almost a couple of years ago. It's only been like a yearish now, but it feels longer. It's a messy process, right? You have to go through health insurance. You have to go through all these medical bills. And look, stuff just sucks. Let's be real. And if you have a more serious injury or something that even threatens your life, you want to have health insurance to take care not only of yourself, but of your family, right? And that's why Policygenius is here to help you create a financial safety net starting today. With Policygenius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer same-day approval and avoid unnecessary medical exams. For those of you who really don't get health insurance, I know I don't, life insurance policies and stuff, there's a lot of jargon, and Policygenius wants to simplify it for you and make it as easy as possible to find a plan that fits your needs and your budget. They help you compare your options from top companies, and their team of licensed experts is on hand to help you talk through every single step of the process. Policygenius comes with thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot from customers who have found their services to be invaluable. So check life insurance off your to-do list in no time with Policygenius. Head to policygenius.com/lockedonnhl or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/lockedonnhl. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's closing thoughts, as obviously for the Jets, next year is going to be a year of growth, a year of perhaps surprises, some good, some maybe not so good, I would imagine. It's probably going to be a bit of a mixed bag. The Jets may barely make the playoffs. It'll all depend on Connor Hellebuyck for the most part, is my guess, unless the kids really hit the ground running and take flight early, which, for the Jets is entirely possible. That's kind of how the 2017-2018 team was structured. But, without Rucker McGroarty in the fold, I do sort of wonder about that a little bit. It would have been nice to convince him to sign before, his, Michigan season starts. Maybe there's still a chance to turn things around. It'll probably depend on what sort of availability of roster spots open up, especially with respect to the middle or even top 6. But Rucker's probably going to take a little bit longer before he gets to that level of play. Instead, the Jets are going to be looking to Lambert and Perfetti to likely lead the way. And that's where I think Perfetti has a chance to really cement himself this year. I think he's played really well as a winger. And I think in the playoffs, you saw him add an element to his game that a lot of people have complained about with him, and that's edge, right? They think he's a soft player who's not likely to grind in the corners and forecheck, but he 100% was relentless in the corners. He hounded Avs puck carriers. He was willing to grind there. He took a lot of abuse and kept going and just got back up on his feet every time he got knocked down. I think that's something that's really underrated. A lot of people talk about size and strength, but in terms of Perfetti, what I would say with him is that he's very persistent. He has a pretty impressive motor, and he's a very smart player, right? So you're not always going to notice him working really hard, but in terms of knowing the right place to be, knowing how to force turnovers, knowing how to psychologically and physically pressure players into making mistakes, that is a specialty of his, and it's why I think he's been so good at making smart defensive reads. There were a couple of moments in the regular season in his last game for the Jets during the regular season where he would have like an empty net situation, and he read a pass that was, I think, intended to be like a tipped shot from the point. He turned that into a goal. He had other plays where he saved 1 or 2 other goals in the same game, and you see him routinely make small little reads and adjustments in the lane gapping and stuff to pick pucks off and really shut down shooting lanes that should be easily available to most opponents, right? Because the Jets, they do allow a lot of those kinds of opportunities, and they don't really clear the front of the net. I actually think Perfetti is one of the best players at defending against that kind of stuff. And he's not the most fleet of foot. He's not going to chase, most puck carriers down if they're flying at like 200 miles an hour. But you know what? He's not that slow either. He's pretty mobile. He gets around the ice reasonably well, and he offers really strong two-way impact. In fact, his defensive impact right now is probably one of his strongest attributes rather than the passing and vision that he has continually demonstrated. So I think there's a lot for him to really hold on to and latch onto and even improve upon. But I think my biggest question is whether the Jets see him as a center or as a winger. I think he can play both pretty well. I think as a center, he has developed enough two-way acumen to be really effective in distributing and essentially being the middle bumper for his two wingers. But I could also see the Jets looking more at him for width play, where they want a bigger, taller center and somebody who is going to, attack the front of the net. Perfetti, I think, is less of that kind of player, although he can do it. I think Cole is more comfortable operating in space and trying to pick corners rather than going right down the middle of the ice. He can definitely do that, and he's done it before, but I think his best play comes when he's creating space, around the net, around the crease, and trying to look for side opportunities. That's where he's really dangerous, and perhaps that's where the Jets would like him to work for the future. Now, assuming that he and Lambert might be fighting for second line minutes, I sort of wonder if you can just have them both, right? If you had Lambert down the middle and Perfetti out wide, you might be able to get away with, I don't know, a Niederreiter or something at left wing. I don't quite know how next year's roster is going to shape up, and it really does depend on Ehlers as well. Nick would be a big piece to retain and perhaps even extend. I don't think he's going to be around much longer, but I could be wrong. I would prefer to be wrong, because I think in terms of the kind of team that the Jets need to build for the future, he is exactly the sort of speedy skater that you want. He's excellent in space. He's a dynamite playmaker. And in terms of his overall creativity, I think there's not many players on this team that bring the sort of skill sets and tool sets that he does. Obviously, he has some consistency issues. I think the playoff scoring drought is kind of a concern, although in some of these series, he's just not alone in that, right? A lot of Jets players seemingly vanish when they're faced against, top-end competition. And it's not because there's a lack of effort. They just struggle to create much of anything against teams that are honestly just eating them alive. So I don't know how much of that I hold against him, but it is true that he definitely needs to step up in the next playoffs if he's still around then. Otherwise, the Jets are going to have to bring in some kind of a roster player. And without Ehlers, it definitely throws a huge monkey wrench into the lineups because, again, you have to make sure that you are getting a good balance of skill and the right sort of, I don't know how to describe it. I wouldn't say chemistry. Chemistry is important, but I think in terms of player archetypes and roles, you want to have really strong transition guys. And that's something that Ehlers is almost unmatched in. There's not many players on this team who can do the same things that he can. And if you just expect the Lambert to immediately pick up that mantle, that's probably asking a little bit more than he's capable of. So a lot to consider there. Obviously, the Jets have more than just a couple of young prospects who are pushing into the Jets lineup here pretty soon. There's a few more guys, and over the next couple of days, I'll probably talk about some of them and whether or not they're going to be impact players this coming year or if they might be a little more distant. But, all I can say is I'm excited, right? I think this is a good transition point for the Jets. I think the past couple of years have been about fixing the locker room and culture. I think they accomplished that goal. Now it's time to really work on the roster and get it up to speed. And that's where Chevy is going to have plenty of work to do himself because you can't just rely on a bunch of prospects and kids to be the ones to really elevate the team. The Jets are going to have to make some smart acquisitions here and really work on figuring out who belongs here and who doesn't over the next couple of years. So plenty of work for the front office to do. We'll continue to talk about that throughout the offseason. But for tonight's, episode, that's going to be all the time that we have. We'll have more offseason coverage tomorrow and maybe even some playoff updates. But like I said, for all the time we have, that's got to be it. I thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow for even more Jets coverage. So see you tomorrow. Have a great one. And as always, go Jets go.